Please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Please welcome back to the stage Meg Szabo, Senior Editor for Bloomberg Green and Sustainability Events.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Just a reminder, I'm sure you've heard me say it many times, but we want to hear from you guys today. Just make sure to scan this QR code that's behind me to submit questions. And for those of you watching virtually, you can submit them using the white tab on the right side of the video window. And you can also use the hashtag SustainableBizSummit. All right, with that, let's get started. Our next session is focused on how building a circular economy can help to reduce Scope 3 emissions. Please join me in welcoming the Director of Sustainability and Climate Action for Barnard College and the Senior Assistant Dean for Interdisciplinary Engagement at the Columbia Climate School, Sandra Goldmark.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sandra Goldmark. I'm so happy to be here with you today. I am here today to talk about the role of circularity in building a comprehensive emissions reduction plan that addresses those hard-to-tackle Scope 3 emissions while also reducing waste and building community connections and jobs. That probably sounded like a sales pitch or maybe just a bunch of jargon. But I'd like to share with you today how I came to understand circularity, how I came to see it as a necessary and powerful tool for a climate strategy, one that I think can be deployed at every level, from the community to the business to the global. The story starts in the theater, backstage, actually. Not that far, this part of the theater. 12 years ago, I was working as a theatrical designer. I was designing scenery for theaters all over the country. I created worlds made out of wooden flats, painted drops, props, costumes. I also created tons and tons of waste. I cared about the environment, theoretically at least, but there I was at home rinsing my little yogurt cups and bringing my canvas bag to the supermarket, while at work in the theater, all of that scenery, those thousands and thousands of pounds of stuff that I designed were going right into the dumpster, show after show, season after season. The worlds that I was creating on stage were miniature versions of the take, make, waste that characterizes the world off stage. It felt not good. I considered quitting. I considered maybe becoming a director or a playwright. Maybe I should, write plays about recycling. Happily, I let go of that idea and came to my senses pretty quickly. I could imagine an alternative. I could imagine a way of designing onstage worlds that were less wasteful, and even a way of designing and making products in the offstage world that made more sense. But getting there felt impossible. I leaned on what I knew. As a designer, I started small, did some research, made a sketch of where I thought we might be heading, and iterated from there. It turned into a long personal and professional journey out of that dumpster, changing the way we designed, working with fellow theater professionals to rethink the way we worked in our industry, rethinking business as usual in our emissions planning at Barnard College, and now as part of the new Columbia Climate School. The common thread, though, in my personal journey was circularity, and it was something that was around me all the time, already in the theater. So the circular economy, you may have heard of this, is very simple. Largely today, we live in a linear system where we extract resources from the earth, we make them into products, very often cheaply and quickly, and very often quickly we throw them away. This is the take, make, waste. The circular economy is about transitioning to a system where we're still extracting some resources from the earth, but less. Those resources are sustainably and ethically harvested. We're designing products that have a full regenerative life cycle in mind. We're bringing repair, reuse, remanufacturing, and refurbishment back into our lives and into our economy, and we have much less waste at the end. Upcycling, remanufacturing, design for disassembly, these are cornerstones of circularity, and they were things that we already did all the time in the theater. But we hadn't been intentional about it. What would happen if we really got serious about using circularity to address our waste and emissions? So, faced with a colleague who was about to quit to go write really bad plays about recycling, my colleagues and I got together and we started looking at the way we did business in our field. First, we started by putting circularity and reuse into our budget. Really, really simply, we took our materials line in our theater department, and what used to be a single line for materials became multiple lines. A line for new material, a line for reclaimed, stock materials, rented. It was a super simple way to name and elevate a practice that we were already doing, but that we hadn't set any targets around. And by setting targets and creating budgetary ways to track reuse, we were able to move to a pattern of having an average of 70% of our sets be made from reclaimed materials. We reduced our dumpster rental from 3 or 4 dumpsters every year to 0. What impact did this have on our emissions? We commissioned a study from Gotham 360 to look at the sets, props, and costumes from one show at Barnard Theater. That show was made at about 50% used materials, and the emissions from sets, props, and costumes were the middle line, equivalent to the emissions from an American home for about 6 months. If we had built that show with all new materials, the emissions would have been the bottom line, more than double, and if we had built it with all reused materials, all used, it would have been the top line, less than half. So, it's a pretty powerful tool. This simple tool and these findings are echoed time and again for off-stage production processes. From t-shirts to buildings, reuse and circularity are simple and effective. But before we leave our theater case study and go into the off-stage world, I wanted to share with you one other surprising impact we found. Prioritizing reuse changed the way we spent our money. We needed less money for new materials, but we needed more for labor. We had to hire an assistant costume designer to go thrift instead of just ordering something on Amazon, hire an extra carpenter to find the used pallets or remove the nails. Prioritizing reuse and changing the way we spent our money made that we were spending more money on people. But actually, spending more money on people was something we had been struggling to do in our department, in our industry, for years. We started out working on emissions and waste, and we wound up working on pay equity. That is what was important for our industry, and that is a powerful tool. So, circularity is also powerful outside the theater. Because of my background in design, repair, objects, stuff, when I was tapped to lead Barnard College's first Office of Sustainability, I was very naturally very interested in the impact of our consumption patterns on our total footprint. I remember when I started the job, I was totally new to the field, and I went and I talked to people, and I said, well, how do we measure emissions? They said, well, scope 1 is the fuel you burn on campus, more or less. Scope 2 is emissions from the electricity you purchase, and don't worry about scope 3. We don't measure that so much. This was around 2015. And I said, well, excuse me, can you tell me more? What's in that scope 3 bucket? And I said, well, it's all the indirect emissions from everything you do after you heat the building and turn on the lights. It's your food, it's your purchased goods, it's your travel, it's your waste. And I said, well, let's look at that bucket. Oh, it's so hard to measure, we don't do that. I was not satisfied, and since then, Barnard has done a deep dive analysis twice of our Scope 3 emissions. We have found that those indirect consumption-based emissions represent as much as 60% of our total impact. That is a big bucket to not even be measuring. So, to tackle those Scope 3 emissions, we're building a circular campus. We've launched an internal reuse platform with Reaply. We're offering free access to the platform to local community organizations and school teachers. We're creating guidelines for design, construction, and deconstruction. And we're reducing waste by looking at what we purchase in the first place. Just like in the theater, circularity is a powerful tool for reducing our waste and our emissions on campus while also supporting local businesses, local jobs, community resilience. The pattern can hold true at bigger scales as well. Barnard's rather shocking 60% figure of Scope 3 emissions is echoed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's report that the emissions that cause climate change come from the production and use. As much as 50% of those emissions come from the production and use of everyday items. Thinking strategically about Scope 3 emissions is a necessity for corporations as well, where that Scope 3 bucket can be huge, as much as 75% or more. And two C40 reports find that indirect consumption-based emissions have been largely underestimated for big cities as well, especially in North America and Europe. If we are to have any hope of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we must reduce those indirect consumption-based emissions, largely in big cities, by at least 50% by 2030. Luckily, the power of circularity to address them can be applied at scale as well. We are currently about 8.6% circular globally. That means that over 90% of the resources that we extract from the earth go into landfill or incineration, often within a year. That's depressing, but it means there's room to grow. And the World Resources Institute estimates that if we can just double that number by 2032, we can cut global greenhouse gas emissions by as much as 39%. That is a powerful tool. Getting there might seem impossible at scale. Imagine I need a broom. I want to sweep my house. I can order a broom right now, today, probably made overseas, and have it delivered to my doorstep tomorrow. It's amazing, actually, if you think about it. But if I want to send that broom to you so you can sweep your house tomorrow and just get it across town, it's an incredible logistical challenge. It's really insane when you think about it. We've built such a powerful global logistical system, but it only really works well going one way. It can bring you right back to this feeling. But we can imagine the alternative. We can imagine an equally powerful circular system. In fact, we know it. It's already all around us, just like circularity was all around me in the theater. It's at your neighborhood school uniform swap. It's at your community compost, your neighborhood listserv, your local repair cafe, your local public library, your municipal recycler. It's in startups around the world who are building innovative models for design, resale, reverse logistics, repair, disassembly. And it's not just startups or those brands that have been way out in front for years. Big players are realizing that if they want to meaningfully build a climate response, they have to tackle that core business model. They have to look at those Scope 3 emissions. And that the way to do it is through circularity. Target, Walmart, IKEA have all embraced circular and regenerative practices as a core strategy for their climate planning. And investors are taking note. Circularity is being recognized as a powerful and necessary tool. And policy trends, especially in the EU, are helping accelerate the change. But circularity is not only powerful, it's intuitive, it's logical, it's familiar. It's what makes throwing something perfectly good in the dumpster feel so terrible. It's rooted in nature, where waste from one cycle is always food for another. And that's why it's not only about emissions or waste. It's about community and jobs. Circularity is about reclaiming what we value, keeping materials in use for as long as possible, and spending our money on people, on care, on maintenance. Yes, sometimes making a change might feel impossible, but like a fed-up theatrical designer I know, we can look around us and see the circularity that's already where we live and work. We can start using it intentionally. We can pull our heads out of the dumpster and imagine a world where business as usual harnesses the power of circularity, those circular practices that are already all around us. We can start small, do our research, make a sketch of where we think we're heading, and iterate from there. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Shaheen Contractor, ESG Research Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence.
Hi again, everyone, and thank you for joining. So just a quick introduction. So I cover ESG for Bloomberg Intelligence, which is Bloomberg's research team. And I describe my job as sort of taking Bloomberg's ESG data and providing analysis into it. So writing about trends, drivers, basically how our clients can use this data. Now I'm going to do about a 10-minute presentation, but I would encourage everyone to just also ask questions, and you can do that through the QR code right over there. Now, today, our panel's following this. We're going to talk about driving purpose. We're going to talk about the S when it comes to ESG. So today I wanted to put a little bit of a spotlight on diversity. And today we're going to talk about 3 ways in which we can drive diversity forward and what our research suggests might work in terms of actually driving diversity forward and what might not have the intended impacts. So before I dig in, just wanted to introduce Bloomberg Intelligence, so BI ESG. Now, this is where all that diversity research lives, along with a lot more. You can see some of the themes we cover, things around portfolio analysis, fund evaluation, and all of this lives on BI space ESG, where I live and breathe. So let's dig straight into ways in which we can drive diversity. Now, the first one is going to be driving diversity through regulation, so policy levers. Now, if we look at the chart to the left over here, we can see the median share of women on boards according to countries, by countries. And here we can see that Europe is a relative leader, right? It's always been, and it still remains. The median share of women on boards is about 40% today. The US is a little after, it's about 30%, and Japan is pretty bad at a little over 10%. Now, why does Europe lead? It's because for years, countries in Europe have had gender quotas. So what does that mean? It means that countries have put regulations in place that require companies to have a certain share of women on their boards. And you can see that in the chart to the right. I'm right, no? Right? Yeah, right. For example, you can see Norway has a 40% quota, which has been in effect since 2008. So that's really been the way in which Europe has driven diversity forward, especially at the top, women on boards. What's really interesting is that Europe has this new EU-wide legislation that actually came into effect this year, and that's going to be across the EU about a 33% board quota. So that means that Europe will sort of drive diversity even forward. Now, while Europe is driving diversity forward, the US has taken a step back. I don't know if how many people know this, but California was the first country. California should be a country, but a state. First state in the US to have a gender quota. But that was unfortunately struck down this year by the Supreme Court. So it was short-lived, which is why you'll see the effective date is 2019 to 22. So that's really the first level. It's driving diversity through board quotas. Of course, there are many more, but that's the most popular policy tool we have. Now, the question is, does that work? Does having a more diverse board lead to a more diverse, maybe executive committee, more workforce? Does it trickle down? That's the question, right? That's how we would measure impact. Our research suggests, not really. If so, we haven't seen it. Trickle-down economics takes decades and decades. If this is supposed to trickle down, it hasn't trickled down yet, right? So we can see here that while Europe leads in terms of women on boards, so that's the first bar, 80% of companies have at least more than 3 women on boards. It doesn't in terms of the share of executives. We can see that in the third bar, where about only 40% achieve that same mark. The US is completely flipped, right? The US is a little behind in terms of board diversity because it does not have these quotas. But the share of executives when it comes to diversity is much higher. So you can see that in the last bar. The share of executives, about 60% of companies have more than 3 women in their executive committee. So it's that flip. Europe leads in diversity on boards. It does not in terms of the executive committee, and the US is a little lower in terms of women on boards, but it's much higher in terms of female executives. So it's very clear that Europe has driven diversity forward by throwing women on the boards, but that has not trickled down. And yes, we could argue that that takes decades, and that could. It very well could, but we still have to see that in the data. Now I'll say that while these board quotas are the most popular policy mechanism, which is why we've evaluated it, there are a lot more. So Japan recently had a pay gap disclosure rule that actually came into effect this year again. And the impacts of that, we'll just have to wait and see. We hope that it'll have an impact because we saw Japan clearly trails in the last slide. So that's really the first one. It's regulation as a policy tool, as a lever. And has it had an impact? Not sure. No, as of now. The second driver of diversity is really investor pressure through shareholder resolutions. So as part owners of a company, an investor can vote on company matters through these shareholder resolutions. And you can see in this chart that proposals around diversity in particular have really accelerated over the past few years. It's a nice gradual trend upwards. What's really interesting and what I find to be probably the most impactful is that there's been this shift a little bit, more so from gender diversity, where there were a lot of shareholder resolutions, maybe up till about last year, and there's a shift a little more to racial diversity. So that's really where the conversation when it comes to investors are shifting. And that's that blue bar. You can see that blue bar, which is racial diversity, has taken up, well, I think all of the increase actually. So that's, I think, one positive trend that we're seeing when it comes to investors actually voting with their feet, right? Creating change within companies. Now, the question of my presentation, does this work, right? So here I'll refer to a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research that suggested that campaigns, so shareholder resolutions by the big 3, so BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, led to companies adding about 2.5 times the number of women on boards in 2019 versus in 2016. So that's actual change, right? That's improvement versus maybe a business as usual, maybe status quo. So that tells me that that does drive change. Sort of investors, again, voting with their feet, pushing change, has actually worked in driving it forward, because that's been the intention so far. Now, the third driver of diversity is company action. So the most common form is incentivizing diversity by, say, taking executive compensation and linking it to ESG factors. And I gave a little preview into this today morning, but I'll go into more detail right now. So basically, say a CEO's annual bonus, that's generally tied to financial metrics, right? Revenue targets, capital expenditures, mergers and acquisitions. But more commonly, companies are actually tying this to ESG factors, in part, of course. Now, I threw this stat out today morning, so I'll throw it out again today. But about 27% of the Russell 1000, so US companies, have some kind of executive pay linked to ESG factors. And that's not a small amount. That's pretty substantial. So of these 27% of companies, in this chart, we're looking at what ESG factors are the most linked to, right? And you can see here that diversity and inclusion is actually one of the highest at 40%. Now, I want to say what's really interesting is when we did this 2 years back, diversity and inclusion was somewhere close to employee engagement at 18%. So I was all set to write this note saying D&I, one of the least linked to, and then I saw this data and was obviously pleasantly surprised, right? It's not only the highest, but it's also seen probably the most increase. Now, does this drive change? Does this actually move the needle? Our research suggests that it actually does. Companies that link ESG issues to executive compensation do see improvement in that issue. And you can see that in the bar, in the last bar. So here, we can see that companies which have, in particular, diversity and inclusion links to their executive compensation see the share of women executives increase by about 6.7% over a 3-year average versus about 6.1% for the Russell 1000. So it's clearly more than the benchmark and more than the baseline. Now, I want to say that division was much larger when we did it 2 years back, so I can only hypothesize that all these new diversity and inclusion links have come in, and it'll take time to sort of see an impact, and it'll take time maybe after a few years. I hope to see that separate out and that sort of difference to be larger, which means more impact. And that brings me to the end of my presentation today. So maybe just to summarize, we've examined 3 ways in which diversity can be driven forward. The first one was really regulation, so policy levers, the most common being gender quotas on company boards. Has that worked? Not sure yet. If it does, it takes decades, and we'll see it in the future. The second one was investor pressure, so just voting with your feet, driving change. Does that work? Yes, we see it does. And the last one, which I think probably works the most, is tying diversity and ESG factors to executive compensation. Because as I mentioned today morning, money does speak, money does matter. If you link your CEO's annual bonus to it, it's going to be a much bigger priority than if you don't. So that definitely works, and according to me, is the most impactful. And with that, I would love to take any questions if we have any.
First question. Can you hear me? Is my mic live? Okay, great.
Yeah.
How do you drive diversity in industries that are facing labor shortages?
Ooh, I think, so that's a complex question. That's an interesting question. I think it all comes down to the talent pipeline, right? I mean, I've seen in many industries, especially tech and finance, the biggest problem has been sort of the diversity pipeline. It's been, there are so many diverse candidates at the bottom of the rung, and there are very few at the top of the rung. So the moment you have a very sort of diverse pipeline or a talent pipeline, I think a lot of it can be mitigated, or at least in part.
Have you examined the correlation between diversity and overall financial performance?
Yes, I have. The results there, and the results are a bit dated, which is why I don't have it today, but I think they still hold. So what we find is that in the US, if we do some sort of like a back test, the companies with the lowest share in terms of women on the boards, they do have the least performance, but it's not linear. It's not like high diversity is high returns, but there's sort of tail risk, right? The lowest in terms of diverse boards, had the lowest returns. And in Europe, it was completely the opposite. It was directly linear, go figure, high diversity, high returns. And unfortunately, nowhere in the world did we see these results. So in APAC, there's no relation. In Canada, Australia, there's no relation with returns. But risk was interesting. So when you think of risk or standard deviation of returns, or basically how stable are your returns, that's where we found meaningful impact across regions. And we found that diversity does lead to lower risk in terms of sort of just volatility of a company's returns. It does lead to lower risk across most regions, and that was our conclusion. Benefits of diversity, lowering risk rather than eating returns.
How do companies define diversity in the US?
Very complicated. I think it varies. I don't think I have a full-on answer for that. I will say in most countries, it would be the part of the population that is the least represented. Of course, what is a diverse candidate in the US differs from what's a diverse candidate in India. So I would say that's how I would think about it. I don't know how the US defines it.
As a follow-up to that question, say some companies are defining diversity based on certain races. Do you think that is an acceptable definition for diversity?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't answer.
I
don't know.
follow the data.
Yeah, I think it's the challenge with analyzing diversity data is companies, being global companies, what is actually an underrepresented population varies across countries. So how do you even quantify that? That's the biggest challenge. That's why a lot of our research focuses on genders, because we still all have to wrap our head around racial diversity. And we think the proxy resolutions or that shareholder action around racial diversity can give us some disclosures that we can work with.
Are you looking at how companies may be masking discrimination by segregating practices, by paying less for certain jobs that may be more attainable for diverse workers?
So if that question refers to the pay gap, which I think it does, we've done some interesting analysis in the past where we found that the pay gap is largely because of, well, let's put it this way. If you take board members, right, everybody is paid the same amount. The fact remains that if you look at committee members for which people are paid more, most of the committee members are men. So the average of the pay sort of gets skewed down. So a lot of the pay gap, especially in tech, especially in finance, is because at the lower levels of management, there are much more, let's just say, there are much more women, and that slowly decreases as you go up, pulling your average down. That's what we've found to be one of the main drivers of the pay gap. It's that pipeline.
What data can we use to demonstrate that diversity and stability of returns have a causative link and they're not just correlated?
Has a positive, sorry, say that again?
How can you, what data can we use to demonstrate that diversity and stability of returns have a causative link and are not just correlated? So
Causation versus correlation.
Yeah.
Tough, very tough. I mean, we did some kind of analysis. I mean, you can assume maybe that bigger companies, size, there's a size bias to it. Bigger companies have more diverse workforces and bigger companies have lower returns. Sorry, bigger companies have lower risk, lower volatility of returns. So you can imagine there's a size bias. The way we tested that is we looked at China in particular. So China didn't really have that size bias. Bigger the company didn't mean more diverse boards, but it still had low volatility. So you can try to control for the size of companies or these normal things that you think might lead to this correlation, but no causation. But it's very hard.
For a company that would like to start to institute a new diversity strategy, what would your advice be?
I think look at some of the drivers that we've mentioned today. Of course, I think the most effective is the compensation links, so linking ESG factors to compensation links. I think another one is, going back to the forward-looking metrics we spoke about today morning. It's setting targets, setting goals, and talking about and thinking about where you want to be rather than where you've been right now. And then, of course, what's the most important is your talent pipeline.
Last question. And we kind of covered the similar question on our panel, but looking to 2023, what are the top trends that you are expecting, like new trends in the space that you're expecting?
The main one, I think, is going to be shareholder resolutions, and in particular in the US around racial issues. So we all know we're seeing a bit of a backlash against ESG, right? So one of the things that have come up recently is, I don't know how to put this, but anti-race, I don't know how to put this, but basically programs that, shareholder resolutions that push companies to not have racial programs. So you have those kinds of resolutions coming in along with proposals around racial issues. That ESG backlash manifesting through shareholder resolutions is something we really expect to come out next year. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Please welcome to the stage Dr. Manar Al-Monif, Chief Investment Officer at NEOM Investment Office, and Suzanne DiBianca, Executive Vice President, Corporate Relations and Chief Impact Officer at Salesforce, for a conversation with Bloomberg Green's Lauren Keel.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you again. Suzanne is running a few minutes late, but don't worry, Dr. Manar and I have plenty of things to talk about, so we're excited to go ahead and jump into that, and she'll be joining us in just a few minutes after Suzanne arrives. We're talking about investing and investing with purpose. And I think you can define investing in a lot of ways. The very traditional way that we would think about it, especially at Bloomberg, where you're actually thinking about the investors and the financial markets. But there's also the investment in terms of resources and training and time. And so I want to talk with you about all these different varieties of investing. But first, let's start with the core of what you do and the core of what we care about at Bloomberg, really, which is around that financial investment. So at NEOM, how are you thinking about how you balance the fiduciary responsibilities that you have, and especially in your role, with the value and the importance of purpose-driven strategies?
Well, that's a great question. Let me start maybe with the most important one, which is sustainability. And I think so sustainability is very important to all of us, and specifically for us at NEOM. It actually measures the way that we operate on a day-to-day basis. It measures the way we select who we work with and how do we work with them. And today we're looking for partners from around the world that really share the core principal values that we have when it comes to sustainability. And when you speak about sustainability and investment, it's funny, a few years ago when you think about it, the word sustainability and investment didn't used to come in one sentence, because people used to tell you anything sustainable is not going to be economically driven. It's not going to generate the right revenues for us. But in today's world, it's actually the opposite. Today, if you want to deliver a sustainable business, a profitable business, it should be built on the foundation of sustainability. And you have a number of use cases around the world that prove this. Sustainable businesses and products have a better market cap and growth of around 10 to 15%. And evident is that what you saw in the capital market, where green bonds actually had 30 basis points difference versus like for like in non-green. You would look as well as the cost of doing business. A few years ago, when you used to speak about sustainability or, example, renewable energy, the discussion would end in a nanosecond because it didn't make any economic sense for the cost of doing business. Today, sustainable practices actually prove to be much better cost for doing business. You can improve your cost by 5 to 10% on average. And most importantly, it's the purpose and productivity. People today, specifically millennials as well as new generation, they feel that if they're in a company that adds value, a company that they can connect to the purpose, productivity improves significantly. And that's really what's very important when you think about sustainability and business today. So the discussion between sustainability and business is much more proven and much more positive today versus what it was many years ago. And at NEOM today specifically, we have an opportunity to look at this from a completely different way. We have an opportunity of a global opportunity that we're presenting to redefine livability, redefine business, and redefine sustainability. And maybe if you'll allow me, I'll just explain what do we mean by this. The possibility for us to redefine sustainability is actually introducing and redefining the relationship between human and nature, trying to really focus on not going only by 100% renewable energy, but trying to define the way of going to net zero carbon, and what are the different technologies and methods that you will be implementing. Redefining businesses is introducing a new concept of developing the infrastructure, developing the laws, regulation, and everything you need around the business to allow them to grow and to develop. And finally, redefining livability, which is an aspect that rarely we focus on when we speak about sustainability and about business. Focusing really on how do you create an environment that focuses on people first, which is something that we've been missing over the last few years because of the nature of life. We've missed that aspect that we speak about people. And how can you create an exceptional life that focuses on them particularly? And how can you bring back to them and make sure you create the right environment that focuses on allowing people to be more happy and develop more things that make sense for them? And that's what we're trying to deliver in NEOM by providing exceptional quality of life that will focus primarily on enhancing the quality of life through technology in harmony with nature. And really, this is a very important aspect because for many of you that may know or might not know, NEOM, we're only developing 5%. 95% will be untouched. And that's the point, to make sure that this is the quality of life that we're bringing to people, where walkability is actually at the heart of everything to do. And you're going to create an exceptional quality of life, focusing on healthy quality of life, because walkability is going to be around everything you're going to do. So that's really how we're looking about developing business, but from a sustainable lens, from a holistic approach.
I think it's a really interesting framing to talk about redefining sustainability and what that means for you. So I'm curious, how are you thinking just more broadly about the importance of ESG for you at NEOM?
Well, ESG is extremely important for everyone, but for NEOM, it's actually the foundation of everything we do. As a matter of fact, NEOM is ESG native. ESG defines everything that we do at NEOM. You know, every decision that we make at NEOM, from deciding what to invest in, which sector are we going to look at, it's going to be done through an ESG lens to look at it. In NEOM, we're trying to, because it's a green field, we're trying to introduce a new ESG taxonomy, new ESG standard, as well as new ESG regulation that will help this industry to grow. We're equally trying to position NEOM as a global benchmark to develop industrial, sustainable practices. In parallel, we're trying to create NEOM to make it an incubation hub for global companies, as well as local champions that really would like to introduce new ESG initiatives that will be able to improve the quality of life on the long term.
I think one of the things that you're alluding to is just the size and the scope and the scale of what you're doing. So I have to imagine there's a huge value of partnerships for you. And this is something where you're bringing in that talent, you're building those teams, but I'm sure you're relying on partners. So how are you thinking about who those partners are, the partners that you work with? How do you choose who you want to be your partners on this journey?
Well, I'm very happy that you use the word partners, because that's really what we're looking for. We're not looking for just people that are going to be investors, or we're looking for partners, people that share the same objective, people that share the same goals that we have, and really are interested to partner with us on the long term, following the same values, the same principle, and together to create a win-win situation. So when we look at partners, there is a number of opportunities for us to work with partners. And I'll take maybe a step just to explain what we're doing at NEOM when it comes to partnership. At NEOM today, we're saying, yes, we're creating a new region. We're creating a city that is going to be focused primarily on sustainable principle at the heart, a city that will introduce a global opportunity to redefine business, sustainability, and livability. We will have 8 regions in total. We've launched 4 of these regions. Just to allude, we've launched Oxygen, which is the first floating industrial city that will introduce the future of industries, Industry 4.0, and it will be home for all of the different types of manufacturer as well as industry that want to invest in really new sustainable products. We've also launched The Line, which is the first vertical city that will completely transform the way we live today. It will be empowered by artificial intelligence that will always look for ideas and ways to make life more simpler and easier for people that live there. We've launched Trojena, which is our mountain destination, which is going to be a touristic destination, a small location that is built around a mountain lake that will host a number of hotels, residential apartments, offering an exceptional quality of life and livability. And 2 days ago, we've just launched one of our islands, Sindala, which is a location and a destination in the shores of the Red Sea that will actually be introducing all the different sports activities as well as different activities around the Red Sea to develop there. In parallel, we have launched 14 different economic sectors, because we're not saying we're going to launch a touristic destination or a nice place just to look at. We're creating a new economic engine for the region and the world based on sustainable practices. And these 14 economic sectors that we created are going to be the foundation to help us introduce the future of business, as well as the future of how economic growth is going to look in NEOM. It is through these sectors we're redefining energy, so it powers our life sustainably. And it is through these sectors we're redefining mobility, so cities becomes more human. We're redefining industry, so it actually coexists with nature, and technology, so it predicts our need ahead of time. It is through these sectors we were able to create a blueprint of what is the future of that sector, the vision as well as the future. For someone to think, well, you're in Saudi Arabia, you must focus on fossil fuel and oil and gas. Well, we're not. In NEOM, we're saying the future is not in oil and gas. It's not in fossil fuel. The future is in energy, but a different source of energy that we need to look at. And a source of energy that will focus primarily on renewable, introducing new technologies in renewable, as well as the supplemented different industry that support this industry to grow in terms of green hydrogen, in terms of water desalination, and so on. And it is through these different sectors we've created the vision, we created the future of what this sector is going to go at, and we've developed a blueprint. And through that blueprint, we were able to prioritize different opportunities and what are we going to focus today. So in terms of time and where to focus on and how to select partners, we actually have a blueprint that will enable us and will help us. What are we going to focus today? What are the opportunities available? Which partner should we engage in? And what to develop and actually making it happen. And it's a detailed work. And the 14 sectors that we've identified are completely different than what people expect. We have energy, we have water, we have food. And all of these are specifically focused from the sustainable perspective, because you want the city to be sustainable. We've identified media, entertainment and culture, education, healthcare. So all of these sectors that you look at are primarily focusing on creating a sustainable environment, but actually focusing on the people primarily. And that's all linked to our vision in NEOM, which is not to build the largest city, the most advanced, the most expensive. On the contrary, our vision at NEOM is focused on attracting the best talent from all around the world that will come and have the ability to develop the most innovative ideas with nothing that will hold them back. We will develop the necessary regulation, standards that will allow all these innovations to grow, develop, and commercialize.
And as you're talking about these blueprints and thinking about how you lay them out, how much of that do you think is very applicable to NEOM specifically because of all of those things that you just mentioned, because of the environment and the authority that you have and building something from scratch? And what do you think is more applicable globally that other people or other cities or other destinations can be learning from?
Well, everything I think so that we'll develop in NEOM can be scaled up and exported globally. Maybe we have the advantage because it's a green field, because there is nothing there today. You have the ability, it's a legacy-free blueprint, so nothing is going to hold you back from any legacy infrastructure. In addition to that, you will be able to develop a set of flows regulation that is primarily focused on allowing the business to grow. And because you're going to be focusing primarily on not what exists today, but you're building something for the future. So you're going to have a better risk appetite to introduce innovations, to introduce technology, test them, scale them, validate them, then export them globally. This is the core of what NEOM's trying to do. So everything that we're doing in NEOM, maybe we have the ability to test, validate, scale, then after that you would like to commercialize this globally. That's the whole intention, and that's the vision of doing NEOM. Because again, the main foundation and the main enablers that you have, you're not going to be able to do this in any developed cities. Today, as an example, we're in New York. It's a well-developed cities. If you want to implement a vertical mobility, can you do this? Can you start thinking of developing a city that you have 0 cars and 0 streets? Can you imagine doing this in a city that's already developed? You're not able to do it. So these are some of the things I believe NEOM have an advantage in, because we don't have anything on the ground. You're starting everything from the ground up. We're actually building the city based on learnings from all around the globe, because there is use cases, there is a good foundation to develop based on that. And we believe taking all of the learnings and actually putting them in a hub in NEOM, scaling them, validating some of these technologies, developing them further. And after that, once the concept is proven, take them globally. That's the main concept of what we're trying to do. And we always call NEOM as the largest living laboratory, because it is laboratory. We're not looking at any conventional idea. It's new innovations and how you really take them to the next generation of development.
That's exactly what I was thinking as you were saying. That sounds exactly like a laboratory and a good laboratory approach. As you describe all of these different things, I cannot imagine all of the ideas and work and priorities that come across your desk every single day. So back to this theme of really investing, moving away from financial investing and more into time. How are you thinking about how you invest the time that you have and the resources that you have? How do you decide one project versus another? What's more important? How do you make that trade-off in your own job?
Well, it's a tough one, because we always say that 24 hours is not enough in a day for us to continue to build what we need to do. We have a very ambitious target in NEOM. We have 14 sectors, 8 regions. Really, the work is day and night to make this dream a reality. And we have a set of targets by 2030 as well as 2045 to achieve. It's simple. The way that we're prioritizing time is, as I said, we have these sectors. We've identified the vision of each of those sectors. We've put what is the future going to look like, what are the milestones to deliver it. We've took that as a foundation across all 14. We've developed an investment strategy based on the input of these sectors with clear timeline based on our readiness and maturity of infrastructure. So you cannot come and have an opportunity that will not have all the elements to allow it to be successful in terms of infrastructure, in terms of certain requisites and requirement to allow this opportunity to be able to materialize and to develop. So we look at the sectors as a main input, their strategies, their vision. We take the input timeline, develop a detailed investment strategy that looks exactly how can we identify the right partners for each opportunity, what is the right business case that will allow this opportunity to materialize, what are the required incentives that we need to have in place to make it happen, and make sure that we work on all of the different enablers to make this a complete business case. And after that, we actually put them across a timeline based on the stages of development that we have. This timeline, if it we define the opportunities based on this timeline. Some of these opportunities, we put them as a base case, which is, it's clear, it's known, we have the required elements to make it a success, and we know we have a detailed business case developed. Some of them, we call them top-line growth, that there is still a lot of unknowns. We're still going to work on these. And once we have clarity, we're going to be able to take it to the next level. And some of these opportunities, we call them white space, because we always need to keep an open eye for new imagination, new ideas that come, and not only just be, well, this is what we have today. We need to have this flexibility. As opportunities come, how are we going to be able to address them? How are we going to be able to actually think outside the box to cater for those and develop the required infrastructure, regulation, as well as incentive in making it happen. So our time is spent focused primarily based on a strategy where we have a goal and a mission of how are we going to be able to deliver. But equally, we are open for business today, and the moment we receive any request from any customer partner, we work with them on the details of how can we make sure that we work hand in hand as one team to mobilize this opportunity on the ground today. So as I said, the day 24 hours is not enough for us to do what we intend to do, but we have a blueprint and a clear strategy with timeline that will help us to prioritize and see what's the focus today versus what should we keep for tomorrow. But if something comes today that we thought that we might need it in 25, but there is a possibility to make it happen, why not?
Why not? That's a smart strategy. Have a plan, but be open to flexibility. Dr. Manar, thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for our conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Please welcome to the stage Crystal Barnes, Senior Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility and ESG at Paramount, Devin Glenn, Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Blackstone, and Ellen Holloman, Partner in the Global Litigation Group at Cadwallader, Wickersham and Taft, for a conversation with Erica Williams of Bloomberg Philanthropies.
Great. So excited to be with you all today. Really looking forward to this conversation with three dynamic women from their fields. I was really excited about this conversation because I think, typically the S in ESG is not talked about as much, certainly not as much as environmental and maybe even, frankly, governance. And so really excited about the opportunity to really hear from you and learn more about kind of what's working, what's not working. So I want to go ahead and get started because we don't have a whole lot of time. So according to recent reports, more than 1,100 organizations committed a total of $200 billion to racial justice initiatives between June 2020 and May 2021. To be spent over 3 to 5 years in the wake of the murder of Mr. George Floyd. From where each of you sit currently, how have you seen the S in ESG defined differently or remain the same in the last couple of years? And I'll start immediately to my left.
Yep. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's good to be here. So at Paramount, I like to say we thrive in the S. That's where we get busy. We get busy in the S. And so, I've seen that companies are now moving beyond, kind of surface level commitments to really digging deep and looking into what they do and deliver best, right? That's where you can have the biggest impact. For us, it's in our content. We are a content producer, a content powerhouse. We have brands that hopefully you all love, like Nickelodeon and BET and MTV and VH1 and Comedy Central and CBS, and I can go on and on. And so for us, it's been leaning into our superpower. We know that media has the ability to change minds, to change culture, to contribute to culture. And so we have a strong responsibility when it comes to that. And so we've really poured our heart into this initiative called Content for Change, which I'm happy to explain later, to really lean into who we are as an organization to be able to measure and evaluate the impact that we have.
Great. Thank you, Crystal. Devin?
Right. I guess I would say similarly, at Blackstone, our people are our most important asset, right? And so fortunately for me in the DEI space, that translates very well to trying to do the things to move the needle with respect to representation of women and people of color and LGBTQ plus employees and more. And what that looks like is, some of the things that we'll talk about, but really being able to invest in looking at our systems and our processes to make sure that DEI best practices are embedded in, not just so that we can continue to bring people in, but that we are investing in programs to make sure that they are moving up throughout the organization and being successful at all levels. I think one of the other things that is great, just to answer the question about what I'm seeing that's different post-Floyd, is the willingness of organizations, Blackstone included, to take head on things like racial equity and systemic barriers to inclusion in a way that we maybe haven't seen before. So that's very encouraging for me. But not just within Blackstone, we are also looking at the S and how we can invest in our people across our portfolio through programs like Career Pathways, where we're providing opportunities for our portfolio companies to grow their pipeline of talent into the organizations and up, and then similarly looking at what impact we can have in communities that we serve through the Blackstone Charitable Foundation and our Launchpad program, which is providing opportunities to students at colleges in underserved communities with entrepreneurial skills and more, again, to make sure that they can be successful in whatever career that they choose throughout their career journey.
Great.
So, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's so good to see everyone. And this conversation really is very important. And I love the way that you started it. The idea that we don't speak about the S enough, I don't know if we're thinking about it correctly or framing the conversation right, because we actually are talking about the S in ESG all the time. You can't talk about sustainability, for example, without talking about communities, without talking about people. And certainly good governance requires that you have some kind of understanding and relationship with social issues. So I think as we approach the E conversations and the G conversations, let's look for those intersections. S is in the middle for a reason, because it feeds both of those other considerations. And then in terms of what I'm seeing, sometimes I think it's easy to focus on the negative, and I prefer to focus on the positive. I am excited this conversation is happening in the first place. And so we have Paramount, we have Blackstone. I come from a law firm, and so our product is a little different. We're trying to provide our clients with the best and most innovative and creative legal advice that we possibly can. And my firm is absolutely committed. The way the S emerges for us is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure that we are fostering and promoting a healthy workplace. I think that ESG considerations have been with us all this time, and it really is a fiction that before ESG, people were investing from a place of neutrality. That's absolutely not the case. ESG considerations have really always been with us, but I think what's changing and what's exciting is that we're thinking about these considerations the way they really finally should be thought about. They are financial considerations. These were thought of as sort of non-financial, good to have kind of considerations, but your reputation is a bottom line issue. And so again, for us, we're really trying to, where we sit, is to make sure that we can give our clients correct and appropriate advice, and that we are able to attract the best talent. And again, that emerges for us in making sure that we have appropriate DEI mechanisms in place. And in some ways, the way that works, hiring is just the beginning. Having a diverse class of associates, that's the easy part. Yeah. Making sure that we retain people, that we train them correctly, and that we promote them is really where we're focused now. Yeah. And that's changed so much in the last 10 years. It used to be just getting people in the door. Now it's getting them up the ladder and making sure that they can stay.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ellen. I kind of want to start with you, kind of where you left off. I think as with when you have corporate standards, there are winners and there are losers, right? There are some people who are going to make great strides and progress in the work, and then some, frankly, will trip up. We know that you have had up close and personal experience in your legal practice with this. Can you talk to us a little bit more? I know you said you want to focus on the positive, but can you talk to us a little bit about some of the hurdles companies are having?
Absolutely. So, nothing's without its challenges, and things that are worth having are definitely worth fighting for. I think in this room, I look around and I see a lot of heads nodding. I think we're all here with open minds and open hearts and interested in learning about these issues. But the challenge, and certainly as a lawyer, I always run into people who are more than skeptical, people who are opposed, people who are not just reluctant, but actually hostile. And so, as a litigator, that's what I do, we're really keeping our eye on ESG litigation. And so, I think ESG litigation in Europe, for example, is far advanced than it is in the United States. So we have well-progressed lawsuits about climate reporting in particular. And we can look to, there's a certain amount of similarity between our legal systems. So we can look across the sea and sort of see how that's emerging and how that's working. But here in the United States, we're starting to see an emergence of anti-ESG litigation. And that's what we have to be prepared for and ready to push back against. For all of us who are excited and who see the values and the benefits of ESG investing, for all of its different criteria, there are people who are very, we can say, hostile and opposed to it. And I can give you just a few examples. We're talking about a little bit about how things have changed in the wake of, George Floyd's brutal murder. And many companies made pledges and said they were going to do things differently, and were going to invest money, and were going to change their workplace practices. But then you see the pushback to some of that. So just as an example, in Florida, Disney had its tax status revoked because it opposed Florida's, and frankly, completely ridiculous law about introducing children to gender diverse concepts in school and teaching that in school. So there's an active government backlash, and we'll see how that survives in the courts. We also have people who are suing what's the best way to put it, to reverse gains that people have made in higher education. And so there's a particularly cynical lawsuit that Harvard is facing now with respect to its admissions practices. So everyone has their eye on that. We've been watching that very, very closely. And very recently, since in the wake of Dobbs, we've had several companies, as part of their ESG initiatives, provide abortion travel services for their employees who might need those services. And we have just recently seen a Trump-appointed EEOC commissioner bring commission charges. And they're doing investigations into companies are doing that on a frankly very dubious legal theory that those benefits would discriminate against pregnant women and against disabled people. So yeah, there's a lot to keep our eye on. And again, I like to focus on the positive and be hopeful. Mm-hmm. If they want a challenge, they're going to get one.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure you're ready for this. Devin, you and I have talked about some pivots Blackstone has had to make in the social practice. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that in terms of measuring your impact and being able to kind of change direction if you don't feel like you're getting a return on the investment?
Right. I guess picking up though on what you were saying, Ellen, where I see hope is that if we view DEI through the lens of a talent function, when we're thinking about things like how we serve our people and how we make sure that we bring the best talent in and put practices in place to move them up throughout the organization, what we find is that those best practices apply to everyone, right? And so we're thinking about widening the funnel to increase access to opportunities at Blackstone and Cadwalader and Paramount. But the bar is still the bar, right? We're still interested in hiring the best and the brightest talent that we can bring in from all kind of backgrounds and identities and so on. And so, I think just framing it in that way, when we do, in the face of challenges, both theoretical and real, I try to anchor myself in the talent and the focus on the people, because that's much harder to push back against. In saying that, though, I'm the first person to hold this role at Blackstone, and one of the things that I have focused on is really taking a look at some of the great work that preceded me to make sure that in the wake of all of the really important energy and commitments that we've seen, particularly following the murder of George Floyd, that we are actually doing the right things, right? That we are seeing them be impactful and delivering us the talent that we need and so on. And I think, as I mentioned to you, one of the challenges that we have in this space is a reluctance to stop doing things. But it's actually necessary that within organizations and you have to stop doing what's not working. As much as this is the right thing to do, it's also a people practice, it's a business, it's being driven by real business needs, and we need to be willing to evaluate our actions with the same rigor. And a great example is just taking a look at our partnerships for our pipeline organizations and saying nothing about the really great work that these organizations are doing. We've had to take a look at, what is the return? Who are we seeing provide us with the best talent that's not only coming in, but has stayed throughout the organization? And One really great one that I'll mention is SEO, or Sponsors for Educational Opportunity. We've seen tremendous results from the impact of that partnership over time, to the point where I said, like, okay, they have these other really great programs, our Alternative Investment Fellows program. Let's double down on that commitment. So I think, right, it's not just about taking resources away, and I think part of the reason too that we feel reluctant to pivot is the sign that it might send in externally, right? No one wants to be seen as having their name removed from a list. But I would just caution all of us to, balance the performative from the actual successful opportunities that exist out there.
Great, thank you for that.
I could
Yeah,
just
please.
double click on that. I also find hope in companies now being willing to not just act on instinct, but to act on impact, right?
Yes.
And so I know in the media space, just being able to do something as simple as to measure the diversity in front of and behind the camera, a lot of that stuff is still happening on Excel spreadsheets at companies. And so getting to the point where you have a robust infrastructure in place to be able to see where you are as an organization, to hold the mirror up to your own company and see what diversity looks like for us on show and behind the camera, is important, so that we can stop doing some of the things that aren't impactful and start doing some of the things that are really going to move the needle, that we could see, in 5, 10, 20 years, maybe even 2, 3, that we've actually done something that has not only changed the physical appearance of our shows, but also the stories that are told, the narratives that are told, the authenticity of the cast, ensuring that they represent all walks, shapes, lives, and colors of this world. That all happens with who is there in the room as the shows are being written, all the way through the entire content creation life cycle. And you don't get that if you don't have robust measurement systems. So I find hope in companies now moving from, oh, this is great, it feels good, we know we need to do it, to, oh, let's actually hold our own selves accountable in a way that is measurable, that we can then start to set targets and goals and put in our ESG reports and all those things, knowing that it's leading towards something.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned this piece around storytelling and narratives, and Ellen, to your earlier point about how we're framing the conversation. So much of that depends on who, to your point, is behind the camera, right? Who's writing these scripts. Can you please tell us, Crystal, more about the Content for Change initiative, which I think is really, really special?
Sure, it's our baby right now. So post George Floyd, BET actually started it as really a social justice initiative to put, again, a stake in the ground to stand in the fact that we know that we have the ability to shape minds and culture and do more. We have, across all the brands that I mentioned earlier, a legacy of speaking to audiences and bringing up topics and issues that, quite frankly, are uncomfortable in society often. But it's a part of our legacy and who we are. That said, taking it a step further to, again, measure the impact of it and not making those content decisions based on instinct was something that we hadn't done. And so it was our next phase of that. It's looking at the content that we produce as an organization. It's looking at the creative supply chain that powers that. So to your point, the pipeline that's coming in, the people that are behind the camera, the writers, the producers, all of that good stuff. And then the culture that we breed. Yes, sure, we want to breed a diverse culture internally, but what does that look like as it connects to our talent and anyone else that's an extension of our brand, an extension of our content? And so it's kind of looking, we call it our 3 Cs, it's looking at the full ecosystem. Because when we can do it in a systemic way, that way we're in a position where we have long-term sustainable change. And so it's rooted in the research. I couldn't have preached that earlier if we're not living it, right? And so we have a lot of great studies going with our friends at Stanford and Annenberg to just, again, understand what does representation look like for us? But then it's one thing to be represented, but then what do the portrayals look like? And that's taking it to the next level, right? And so doing good on representation, big opportunity as it relates to portrayals. And so we want to make sure that that then impacts the resources that we allocate towards this, the programs that we put in place, the ones that we sunset, and the new ones that we bring on board. Because if it's not predicated in the research, then what's the point?
Yeah.
And so that, for us, is kind of like our 360 view, and something that we then last year made a commitment across our entire organization. So all of those brands have a commitment to Content for Change, and we're evaluating everything that we do.
I'm glad you mentioned the data and the research. How would you respond to criticism, and this is really for anyone, from stakeholders to say that there has not been a lot of data transparency when it comes to ESG in terms of the quality of the data, making the data just purely available? What would any of you say to that?
I have just a mischievous comment, about something about that.
Do it.
I'm ready.
Yeah, which really is, a lot of companies, even before George Floyd, but certainly afterward, rushed to their social media platforms, got on TV. Anytime anyone could say it publicly, they announced that diversity was a core value of their company. So along with core values like innovation, ethical behavior, efficiency, we don't have a lot of studies about why we need ethical behavior. We don't study, we don't study, why we need to be efficient. We don't talk about why innovation is a core value. We don't have to back that up with studies at every board meeting. So if we're going to say that diversity is a core value, why do we keep having to show up with studies explaining why it's important? That to me is my one mischievous comment. But to have a more serious comment, it is incredibly important to have this data because we do have to deal with skeptics and we do have to deal with stakeholders who aren't fully bought in. And so providing data about why it's effective, why it produces better outcomes, why it produces, really why it's a bottom line issue, I think it's much easier to convince people who are skeptical with facts and figures as opposed to sort of passionate arguments. Just point them to the data and show them how the bottom line is improving, show them how risk is being managed better. I often say this, but especially for people who are working in the financial services institutions the way that I am, the concept of diversifying your portfolio to hedge and manage risk is not at all a foreign concept. And if you can relate that to people, having a diverse group of people to work with. Because the other slightly mischievous comment I have is that people are not diverse. Groups are diverse. Okay, a single person is not diverse. A person is a person. But groups of people can be diverse, and you really have to work on that group dynamic.
Yeah. I took, I think also slightly mischievous. Prior to joining Blackstone, I also was in the legal industry, both as a practitioner and a DEI professional, and spent a lot of time answering requests for workforce data. Yep. And I'm of two minds. There's my theory, as someone who's trying to have impact, it's super helpful for clients, again, wearing my legal professional hat, it was helpful for clients to show interest, and asking for the data is one way to do that. On the other hand, this is even before George Floyd, we saw our requests for client information go from something like maybe 25 annually to over 200 in the span of 2 years. So then I have to, dedicate a resource or two to answering those requests. So the person, as one who's responsible for the outcomes, I wonder if we're striking the right balance as to why we're asking for the data, who's asking, and what you're going to do with it. Because what we tend to find is it goes out there, we spend a lot of time putting it out there, and then there's silence. And so I think there's value certainly in transparency when we're thinking about how we change minds from a change management perspective. For sure, it's helpful to provide people with data, and we know you can't improve what you're not measuring. Mm-hmm. So I think almost a better question is to ask organizations, are you leveraging analytics to inform your DEI practices? And I think universally the answer would be, or should be, yes, right? And then I think would be more comfort then too from organizations to be more transparent externally if we knew why we were being asked and what conclusions people would draw. Yeah. Because there's that risk. Once you put it out there, is that good? No one's would say that they're doing amazingly well. We know that this is a journey and that it's gonna take time. But without the ability to provide that information as part of a broader conversation, I'm not sure about the long-term value in that.
I agree. I mean, data without accountability means nothing.
Yeah.
It means nothing. And so I do think, though, there needs to be a standard, to your point. The data that you're going to request needs to be connected to an action that you were going to take.
Absolutely.
Period. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, don't ask for the data. And so I just think as individuals within an organization, as leaders within an organization, and just as an industry, if you're going to put data out there, it needs to be connected to a goal that you plan to reach over a period of time. To your point, we all know this is a journey. And we all know that you need to set a North Star. That's important. And that North Star should be rooted in the data. But you have to work towards it. You have to be transparent along the way, the successes and the losses, so that you get to the point where your data is validated and you can now take it up a notch. Data should encourage you to be ambitious. Data should encourage you to step in places that feel uncomfortable as an organization because you've used it as the route to map out where you want to go.
Absolutely.
Period. Yeah. And without the data, again, like earlier, it was, oh, well, we don't have the data, well, we don't know. Well, we have the data now, and so what are you going to do with it? And that's what's important.
Yeah.
Thank you. I wonder if we have questions from the audience.
Yes, we do, in fact. We have a question. Can you address awareness and measures to correct age discrimination and the discounting around career breaks?
I think one of the things that I've been encouraged to see, over the time I've been doing this work is a willingness to think expansively about how we define diversity, right? We're having more conversations around neurodiversity and ability and the different gender or the different ages that are represented, generations is the word I was going for, generations that are represented within organizations and how they communicate differently and how we can flex our work styles and so on. And so I think what I am trying to do, and what I think a lot of my peers in this space are trying to do, is just have more of those conversations and more of that awareness around the different identities and experiences that we bring to work and how that should inform how we engage one another to create more belonging in the workplace.
I agree, and I think it goes back to your data point, right? So we have a lot of programs within our organization that get a lot of kids that are entry level, and so we realized that there was an opportunity to get young adults, that are from non-traditional backgrounds. We're specifically looking for someone that didn't go to a four-year college or university. A lot of times that could be someone that is of the older generation. But we have tons of jobs, from grips to production to writers to producers. All of that is important. And so we're using the data to try and figure out how do we balance out the entry level to the more midterm manager level to the senior levels. And create programs that cater to that. So again, it's all in the data. It's all in the data, you just have to apply it.
Great, thanks. We have another question. Tomorrow marks Latina Equal Pay Day. What are your perspectives about Latinas being the most underpaid BIPOC demographic of women, experiencing close to a 50% differential in pay?
Wants it?
I would say say right away, it's appalling. Like that would be the first thing to say. And that I'm really happy that we are doing these days of awareness. It's really, really crucial. Statistics like that just fly over the heads of some people, and they don't really think about what it means and sort of how to correct it. And my reaction to that always is that we have to come up with concrete plans to address it. And you have to do that through your organizations. The best way to deal with pay equity is to get your top level management involved and make sure that they are on board, that they understand what the issues are and why it's important to correct these injustices and imbalances. And then you have to, from sort of the ground up, make a concerted effort to make sure that you are identifying your candidates who are talented, who can succeed, give them the tools to do that, realize and accept without judgment that there are barriers to people's success. That's really what it is, and that moving those barriers is not necessarily the responsibility of that particular Latina. She needs the assistance of the people around her. She needs support of management. She needs a sponsor. The way that white men sponsor each other unconsciously, they've been doing that for years, we have to empower our male allies to understand that they don't necessarily have the skills to sponsor women or people of color, and give them those skills. Because there are many, many people who are on board with this and want to see change, but they don't know how to make a difference. So having just gosh, I wish it would change is not enough. You need a plan. It's a plan that starts when people come in the door. It starts with the hiring process, and it has to be a path forward. And it's something that, diversity isn't something that just happens magically. It's socially constructed. And it takes a lot of effort. And just because you have a diverse class one year doesn't mean you're going to have a diverse partnership 10 years later. You have a tremendous amount of work in between. And so that's what I would say to that. That it's not just like, oh, great, it's a day, it's a day to think about these issues. It is a day to think about these issues and plan for the future.
I'm glad you mentioned future. In our last couple of minutes, I want us to take a moment to think about the future. If we are sitting here 5 years from now, what do we want to be able to say about the S in ESG? Anyone can start.
I don't know, maybe 5 years from now, we don't have a job in ESG because it's already permeated into organizations.
And that would be a good result.
It would be a
take
good result.
I would take
it. It would be a good result. I would say that the S is involved in every single thing that you do as an organization. That it's not just the CSR department, the ESG department, and all the other departments that are connected to the S, that it is truly embedded into who you are as an organization. And that the most important asset that you have as a company, your employees, feel a connection to the success of the S. It shouldn't just be a department, it's everyone's success, right? And that's one of all of the E and the G. The S to me is one that everyone can get behind across the lifespan of an organization and feel personally and professionally connected to the role that they play in the S. So that's my hope, is that we have more allies across organizations to really move the needle forward, especially as we're talking about pipelining and everything else.
Yeah, and I guess as you say, ally, one of the ally behaviors is just a commitment to continued education, right?
Yeah.
To staying the course. And when I think about, 5 years from now, I really hope that we're continuing to stay the course, right? I'm a little bit more of a cynic. I think we'll still be talking about this, but I don't think that's a bad thing, because even in a perfect world, if we do have, all of our organizations reflect the communities and the people that we serve, we're still going to have to focus on principles of equity and inclusion and making sure that the outcomes, match our intentions. And so I'd just love to see a sustained conversation around these issues and more comfort being uncomfortable in the workplace, talking about things like generational differences and sexual orientation or neurodivergence and so on.
Just very briefly, I would like to say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I want to see, to Crystal's point, the need for these conversations as we're having them as a matter of urgency to change, and to become more conversations of how do we get better and better and better at this. That's what I'm looking forward to. And when I retire, being able to sort of listen to younger people saying, "Are you kidding? There weren't women on boards?" That would be, that would be terrific.
Wonderful. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists today. Thank you so much.
Hello again, everyone. All right, so Suzanne has arrived. So we're going to do a quick one-on-one conversation with Suzanne and Lauren Keel before our final panel, which is our supply chain challenge. So please join me in welcoming Suzanne Bianca, Executive Vice President, Corporate Relations and Chief Impact Officer with Salesforce, for a conversation with Bloomberg Green's Lauren Keel.
Hey again, everyone. I think you thought you were done with me, but I'm back. Good to see you again. And Suzanne, we're so happy that you're here. Thanks for jumping up on stage with us. I want to talk to you about this topic about investing in purpose and really thinking about the way that you are getting internal investments at Salesforce. So when you're going to, all your board, to all the internal leaders and trying to get people to invest more in sustainability, what are the cases that you're making? What resonates the most?
Thank you, and apologies for being late. I had a nice little tour around Midtown in high heels, which was fun. I forgot about the having to go through Grand Central part of it. It's a great question. It's really timely as we think about this sort of global macroeconomic headwinds that you hear a lot about. I was with our board recently, and two things really come to mind around the investment question. The first thing I said is, all that might be true, and I grew up in, enterprise technology and software, and if you've been following the industry, it's not been pretty in our industry as of late. But what I said is, the climate change is not going to wait for a tech correction or for macroeconomic headwinds. We have 7 years and 2 weeks, essentially, to keep to a safe degree of warming and reduce global emissions by 50%. And they rose last year at 10%. So, we can't slow down. We have to continue to go fast. And what I love about it is I was looking at the data on emissions and on our renewable projects. We made $8 million this year on our renewable energy projects. So we're in the black on that for the company. And there is energy prices that have increased, and there's been some things that are environmentally happening that is sort of unpredictable with renewable. But I love the fact that that's a positive for the company. And emissions is the same thing. We had this conversation just with our executive team just an hour ago, and I said the best thing about working on emissions reductions, we have a 50% reduction target by 2025 and an absolute at zero by 2030, is that when you save on emissions, you save on travel dollars, you save on building efficiencies. So when you reduce emissions for the company, you're actually saving the company money at the same time. So for me, the case is both climate change won't wait, whatever's happening in the company and the world. And second, if we do this right, we'll benefit as a company and benefit the planet at the same time.
Right, so even if you want to ignore the climate challenge that's looming all over all of us, the financial part is hard to ignore, right? The savings that you're saying or the money that you're making is harder for people to say no to.
Yeah.
And as you're thinking about how you're investing your time and what you're prioritizing, what projects you pick, how do you weigh which directions you want to go in?
Well, I think one of the panelists said it just in the last session. From my perspective, the E is also everyone's job, in addition to the S. Frankly, so is the G. So, we operationalize, we put sustainability as a value in our business plan this year. We actually never add values. I've been at Salesforce for 22 years. And we haven't added a value in 5 of those years. So we added sustainability as a value this year. And so what's happened is that now the whole company is operationalizing that value, which is really cool.
What does that mean to add it as a value?
Yeah, so we have core values, and that's how we run the company. Trust, there's nothing more important than trust. Customer success, always putting our customers first. Innovation, constantly innovating. Equality we added as a value about 5 years ago, and then operationalize that. So we operationalize all our values, and then sustainability. So the way that it shows, I only do 3 things. The sustainability team, we work on net zero now, keeping all of our public commitments to be a net zero company and trying to get all of our customers to net zero. Nature positive, we have trillion tree effort and some other things we're doing in the nature positive space. And ecopreneurs, looking for incredible entrepreneurs that are working on climate solutions and getting behind them. So the sustainability team focuses on those 3 things. But now, in terms of investment of time, I have the engineering team who came to me and said, here's a carbon to serve metric. And I'm going to reduce my carbon to serve by 30% in the first year. And it was amazing. So they're coding in a more efficient way. They're really looking at data center efficiency. Marketing came to me and said, what if we run these like net zero events and use all sustainable, food and we save like 6 million gallons of water by, not serving beef at our events. And then finance came recently, and we bought a company called Slack, and we did that through a green bond. So, all over the company, they're operationalizing this value based on, kind of wherever they're sitting in the business.
And are you involved at all in training your sales force, your workforce to actually better make this part of their jobs? Like, are you guys thinking about how you take people who maybe didn't come from a sustainability background or have not worked in this or studied this? How are they thinking about how they take that to sales or marketing or whatever else?
Yeah, I think 2 things. One is they're just thinking about how they're being sustainable in their own work. That's no training required, but it's smart engineers that are what if we develop a carbon to serve metric? That would be really cool. So that part is just people's own individual ambition, commitment, clarity that climate change really matters. The second part of it is we do have a free learning platform. It's called Trailhead. And so we have all these sustainability trails, and they're everything from how to work from anywhere in a green way, how to reduce your home home energy usage, to things like from a sustainability, like what does a renewable project look like? Where are our projects? We're like very focused in places where we need to green the grid, like West Virginia. So we have like education programs on sustainable topics, but we try to, for the most part, A, like meet people where they are, help them in their day jobs, and B, just help them people as like individuals. We have a program that's enables a 15% discount to put solar on your home, for example. Some credit if you buy a EV car. So we're thinking about our benefits and really kind of transitioning them to sustainable benefits too.
What's that thing that's keeping you up at night about your work?
Well, the fact that we rose global emissions last year at 10%, and we need to get at a 50% reduction in the next 7 years. I think that is the thing, like how can we go faster? I think, I love being in New York. First of all, I'm from here, so I love being here for that reason.
Best city.
Best city. But also because I think the finance and investment community have been driving this conversation in the absence of government policy and legislation. So I wish we were going faster. I'm glad the EU has done what they've done, and now it's regulatory. In the next month, people are going to have to report. That's going to impact large enterprises in the US anyway, even though we don't have regulation. But I keep thinking about collectively, how can we go faster? The business community can move faster in certain cases than the government can. I live in California, and California is like way out in front from an environmental policy perspective. But I think that having states in different place, where like I love the federal government to kind of jump in a bigger way. I'm really excited about the Inflation Reduction Act and the money that's going to go into electrification and renewable energy. I just wish we would do more from a regulatory perspective.
That's great. Anything that you are looking forward to next year, as we think about coming out of COP this year, coming into COP next year, anything that you really want to see on the big worldwide climate agenda next year?
I'm really focused on the nature positive agenda. I'm really, really excited about that. I think that, in addition to all the environmental benefits, you get so much from a biodiversity perspective, from a jobs perspective, economic development, really looking at like nature positive strategies. I think they just have so much more robust impact. I am excited also, on the other hand, on the carbon removal technologies that I'm starting to see and really helping to get them to scale. And I guess the last thing is really just this like explosion of ecopreneurs, all these entrepreneurs that have shifted either from big companies or various startups to really, have businesses that are really focused on climate change, whether it's biochar and advanced weathering and all this stuff that I've learned about, or direct air capture. There's just so much innovation happening, so we're really tracking that.
It's exciting to see how many people are choosing to invest their time and their wealth and their resources and all of those things in this space.
They have to do it.
Yes.
We all have to do it together.
Thank you so much, Suzanne.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Short and sweet.
Businesses need to go net zero now, but the path to net zero isn't always clear. Meet Net Zero Cloud. Reducing carbon emissions is everyone's business. Let's break down silos between companies and their suppliers and customers. Let's empower employees with easy tools that make them part of the solution. Let's do it with data and real insight. Let's lead with trust through the greatest challenge of our lifetime.
Please welcome to the stage Ezgi Barcenas, Chief Sustainability Officer at AB InBev, Jennifer Bisegli, CEO of Interos, Pooja Goyal, Partner and Chief Investment Officer at Carlyle Global Infrastructure, for a conversation with Bloomberg Green's Leslie Kaufman.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be with you. I'm Leslie Kaufman with Bloomberg Green.
I feel like we're very lucky today because we have 3 women who know the supply chain from a variety of different angles. So I think we're really going to get a broad perspective. Pooja looks at the supply chain from the point of view of an investor. Jennifer has a platform and she advises company on her supply chain. But I thought we'd start with you, since you actually run your own supply chain. I think the question I'd like to sort of start just to lay the table is, what are the big challenges? Obviously, this has been, supply chains have entered the public domain as something that regular people talk about ever since China and COVID. So when you look at this upcoming year, we have 2 issues. One is just what are the biggest issues for the supply chain, and then what do you see as the biggest issue when you talk about sustainability?
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. So for those of you that may not be familiar with AB InBev, we are the world's leading brewer with operations across nearly 50 countries around the world. We are a global local company. So we do see the far-reaching implications of climate change across our entire value chain. And for us, the way we'd like to think of beer at ABI is beer is inclusive, natural, and local. Inclusivity comes from working with tens of thousands of smallholder farmers in the field side by side as a trusted partner, all the way downstream to millions of small retailers that we work with, mom and pop shops, and we work to close digital inclusion gaps, financial inclusion gaps, amongst those entrepreneurs. Natural, we work with nature instead of against it. We have a lot of raw materials in our products, so barley, hops, etc. So again, agriculture, water stewardship, these are key priorities for us. And last but not least, local, as I mentioned, with operations in nearly 50 countries. So for us, when we think about supply chain and the challenges, we'd like to think of our role as, how can we use our spheres of influence and how can we really bring our supply chain partners along with us on the journey towards decarbonization, towards creating that resilience. I think why you do what you do really matters. So, how we think about supply security and building that resilience on one hand, but at the same time coupling that with, the innovation angle. What does the future of agriculture look like? The future of packaging, the future of logistics. And we really feel that as we start asking these questions, it's very important that we bring others along with us on the journey. So I think this will be a key focus for us, again, going into next year.
But when you look at what were the challenges, like what would be the hardest thing, in terms of this year, in terms of what you faced, in terms of getting what you needed to your brewers, or was there any specific issue? Was it?
Because we are, almost all of our products are locally sourced, brewed, and enjoyed. So for us, we didn't see some of the big global supply chain disruptions that others may have seen. So we continue to invest locally in building that resilience, building local capacity. So I think, again, as I mentioned, building that capacity locally, bringing in the innovation, creating those collaborations within the supply chain will be really key for us to make huge advancements towards the future. Yeah.
Jennifer, how about you? You have a lot of different clients, and what were some of the big challenges they're facing right now? Not all of them are local. I'm assuming that there's a lot of lessons to be learned about a local supply chain. And what were the big challenges, and how does that relate to sustainability?
And thank you for having me as well. So Interos, for those of us that don't know, we map and monitor global supply chains. Right now, our AI platform monitors about 350 million businesses around the world. And we're monitoring not just for who's doing business with who and whether that's a good or a bad thing, but to your point, when the pandemic hit, we had a lot of organizations, a lot of customers concerned with, were there sub-tier suppliers? Did they have the financial wherewithal to keep going? Did they have the labor to keep going? And then when you think about here in the States, we had SolarWinds that occurred, so cyber breaches, sustainability and ESG. And I think what Ezgi just went through is really interesting, because whether it's a local supply chain or a global supply chain, I think one of the biggest challenges as well as opportunities is really the cultural shift that you just went through from a leadership standpoint, and really understanding that sustainability and ESG, why some people see this as a challenge because of the cost of doing it, saying it's the cost of doing business with, this is really the way to drive brand loyalty, whatever that's called right now, as well as profitability. And I think that from an ongoing standpoint, as you highlighted, Leslie, it's still rolling pandemics. It's still shortage of labor. It's still this recession that we're talking ourselves into. It's the restrictions. It's the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of geopolitical concern. For the first time ever in my 20-some-year career as a logistician, geopolitical risk outweighs just about everything else. But I think the theme of this conference and the focus that we're talking about here, sustainability and ESG is really brand and reputation. And that can cost just as much as any other type of business interruption.
Okay. And how about you, Pooja, from an investor, someone who's looking at, especially clean energy, right, is where a lot of your focus is. Are supply chains something, I mean, I know I've read that you look a lot at the politics and how local politics are going to see how things are going to impact. Do you look at supply chain issues? Do you worry about, I don't know, critical minerals?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you for having me here. And just by way of background, Carlyle has about $370 billion of assets under management. And we truly are a global investment firm with investments in companies, assets, and then overall businesses across multiple different sectors. So when we think about supply chain, we actually have two different perspectives. Our first perspective is actually as an investor in these companies that operate across multiple sectors as well as multiple geographies. And what the pandemic highlighted was that just-in-time inventory may not be the most risk-mitigated way to operate your business. And then the pandemic, on top of that, you have to layer on the geopolitical complexities around the war in Ukraine, which has resulted in an escalation of commodity prices and a focus on supply chain security and energy security. So first of all, we actually deal with this just as owners or investors in these portfolio companies. So we have a front row seat to a lot of these issues that were just mentioned. And I do think that this issue is a lot more complex. At the end of the day, ESG or sustainability is at the heart of everything that we do at Carlyle. So we want our portfolio companies to focus on sustainability when they're thinking about their procurement practices, when they're thinking about their manufacturing practices, and then ultimately when they're thinking about getting their products and services to their end customers as well. So ESG is a very holistic view that we apply across all of our portfolio companies. Since you specifically asked me about energy transition, which is a focus of ours within our infrastructure business, I would say by far energy transition is one of our biggest growth areas within infrastructure. And that's not only because of climate change, but also because of energy security. I do think that energy transition is somewhat unique. We are beginning to see supply chain issues abate a little bit as the market is opening up quite a bit across all sectors except for energy transition. When you think about energy transition, a lot of the supply chain is localized in Southeast Asia. There are some significant concerns there around manufacturing practices. For example, there are some geopolitical tensions that are in place there, so you have to learn how to navigate around those issues. We believe we have the capabilities to do that because of our global presence as well as our strategic relationships. But I do think that that is an important focus. But even if you leave that aside, you are on a growth trajectory for energy transition that is somewhat unprecedented. And it just got accelerated even more because of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Right. So you have a historically underinvested supply chain right now. And just like any commodity cycle, you need to invest in that supply chain so that it can keep up with demand. And that includes not only investing with manufacturers, but also further upstream, which goes back to your question around metals, minerals, rare earths. And that becomes an important focus as well.
So I do want to talk about the opportunities that are presented, but it occurred to me just in listening whether we might ask you to define what sustainability means to you, because it's such a broad topic, and for some people it might just mean making sure that the water and is used sustainably or the land is used sustainably, but it might also be about energy. You might have another problem. For instance, you might need minerals, which are mined, which are not good for the earth, but you're producing clean energy. So are there some things you put into sustainability? Is there anything you could knock out? How do you define it so it works for you?
Maybe I'll kick it off. Sustainability has many dimensions, environmental, social, economic. And increasingly what we're seeing is that you have to multi-solve. So you can't just tackle the environmental challenges. You can't just go and try to solve for economic challenges, but you have to look at it more holistically. And that's what the pandemic has also shown us, right? The materiality of environmental social governance metrics within a business have become really important because now for the first time we understood the implications of environment on global health, on economy. I think it's quite broad, but most important is how you think about what makes sense for your business, I would say.
And you particularly, is there anything you can limit? Like, we're not going to look at that. That can't be part of sustainability. Do you put any limits on it?
I think sustainability is an area where you can't pick and choose, right? I think this is why materiality is so important, right? We have to really focus on what are the non-financial indicators that are material to your business and continue to tackle for that. And then there will always be topics that are more philanthropic focused or citizenship focused within the local communities. But as you think of sustainability, it needs to create that shared prosperity for the business as well as the communities and planet.
I mean, what do you advise your clients? They can't do it all,
Well, you can't, and I think you answered spot on. It has to address the value drivers of your organization. And I think as someone that owns your own supply chain, you're a bit at the crosshairs of what are the regulators telling me I need to take on? What are my consumers willing to continue to buy from me as long as I adhere to? And more is how can I attract the talent I need, because people are making decisions with their feet of who they go to work for based on the principles you stand on. And I mentioned to you before we came out here, I got called in to meet with the CEO of a major entertainment and media company, which is not core to our go-to-market strategy. Because if you think about supply chain, that's probably not where you go first. It wasn't where I went first. But increasingly, they were literally having mini protests by their employees because they weren't taking a stand on how water was being used or how they were investing in good earth and doing well by doing good. And I find that really very interesting. And so, yes, we don't have enough money, and the impact isn't as great for everything at the same time, but you do really have to balance on that brand reputation, which is both from a consumer standpoint, where brand loyalty, I think over the last 3 years has become very, very hard to keep, the regulators, and attracting the talent you need.
And how about you? How do you balance it as someone looking at a huge portfolio with a lot of different options? I mean, you need rare earth minerals, but, sometimes it's ugly how they get out there.
Well, and we have to balance the fact that our primary target is to generate our target returns. So we're very focused on commercial outcomes. Look, I'll say two things. The first one is that when it comes to managing supply chain issues, it is a partnership. It is a partnership with the CEOs of our portfolio companies. But more importantly, it's also a partnership with the different suppliers. We do a lot of procurement across our portfolio companies. That's actually one of the ways that we drive value creation within our portfolio companies. And I have to tell you, our suppliers are willing to lean in and work alongside with us. And that has been a very collaborative process. So we are making incremental progress working with these suppliers in terms of solving around some of these ESG metrics. The second thing I would say is we all have to apply a dose of practicality or reality to what we're doing here. And to give you a very simple example, in infrastructure investing, we focus a lot on the carbon intensity of the assets or the businesses that we invest in. You're asking for a metric, that's a metric that we focus on. Well, we always say that reducing the carbon intensity of these assets is a transition. It is not a revolution. You cannot just flip a switch and go zero emissions immediately. And I think the same philosophy applies to a certain extent, even with managing your supply chain.
Well, so we've come out of this very intense period. I'm not sure we've come out of it. We might still be in it for a while, but we seem to be in a period where, the Inflation Reduction Act has been passed. China seems to be loosening up. Supply chains seem to be a little. What are the opportunities, if you want to start maybe, what do you see as the opportunities in the coming year for making your supply chain more resilient and more sustainable?
Yeah, so that is kind of that second perspective I was talking about as an investment firm. Our first perspective is obviously as a business owner or investor. Our second perspective is that, look, wherever we see disruptions or, I would say like an imbalance, that is where we see opportunity. So for us, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in terms of investing in the supply chain, especially around the energy transition. The passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, there has been a focus on onshoring manufacturing capacity.
Right.
We think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity around that. And that is one that we are very organized around right now. So that is the one place where we're seeing a lot of opportunity. Another place where we are seeing opportunity is really rolling up our sleeves and working with the management teams of our broader private equity business in terms of implementing some of these practices that Jennifer was talking about and really helping them think about their supply chain in a more holistic and sustainable business as well. So the first one I would say is an investment opportunity. And then the second one we think is value creation, which hopefully should lead to better exit multiples and valuations.
How about you? What are you telling, Jennifer? What are you telling your clients?
So I love that you went right for the fact that we have to make money, because at the end of the day, that's really what we need to have happen, no matter what solutions we're looking at. But I think there's 4 areas that are opportunities that we're seeing folks move to, and in Teros, we work on 2 of the 4. One is just the upskilling of labor. And that's a massive change, because a lot of folks are driving, as you're talking about the stress on the supply chain is being reduced, we've had 3 years to make some cultural shifts, leadership shifts, investment decisions, and you're seeing folks making those changes. That's what you're feeling. There's a new understanding. I mean, the conversations I'm having now with CEOs of world brands, I was not having 5 years ago. That's happened the last 3 years because our CEOs are realizing how closely the health of their supply chain and being able to fulfill orders and operational resilience is to their business bottom line. So the first thing is using data to inform where am I going to make those investment decisions, and a lot of that's the upskilling of labor throughout the supply chain. The second is what you just touched on from an infrastructure and a manufacturing. Look at the major announcements with TSMC that came out of Arizona yesterday. The onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever you want to call it. It's just alternative sources of supply, but massive investments in that. The third opportunity is really where we play as a home run, which is really the transparency of the supply chain, because I don't know where to invest. I don't know where to double down if I don't understand what my supply chain looks like. And then the last, and you also talked to this, is the partnership. There's a massive push to bring our supply chain closer, not in proximity, but from a working relationship. We started, my company, I started as the US federal government was my customer. And that's still really hard, that public-private partnership. But if you think about the supply chain of the government, any government is really the private sector, you're seeing more of that partnership. So that last opportunity, so you have the infrastructure manufacturing, you have the labor upskilling, you have the mapping and monitoring of the supply chain, so you understand if you're doing the right things and you're investing in the right places. And then the last is, how do I collaborate with my suppliers better? So when things do go bump in the night, when regulations change, when something gets interrupted, we can make decisions faster, which keeps costs down and allows us all to react at a better price and quicker.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you already have a very, as you say, localized but global localized supply chain. So that seems like a good place to be in this world, but what do you see as the opportunities and the things?
Yeah. I would definitely agree with Jennifer and Pooja around the need for upskilling or reskilling, the partnerships, the manufacturing side, and I would maybe bring it all together to say, for us, we have also gone through this realization about 6-7 years ago where we moved the sustainability function into our supply chain. So that's our operations and procurement teams, because we realized that that's where the greatest impact and risk is, and that's where we can continue to build these partnerships. And it's really changed the dynamics of how we engage with our suppliers, because now we started having more strategic, more longer-term conversations as opposed to just transactional discussions.
Can you give just one example of how that works?
Yeah. So. Putting the sustainability team and responsibilities within procurement and operations teams, right? So that cultural shift, as was mentioned, is so unique because now you're actually co-designing what sustainable innovation or what future commitments your company should be making. So we went through that around 2018 timeframe when we were coming out with our public commitments, our 2025 sustainability goals. And what that has enabled us to do was actually come out with a set of public commitments that were designed or co-designed by cross-functional teams. You know, not only the corporate affairs, legal, people teams, but also you know, procurement, supply chain, R&D.
So important.
So it's so unique and so important to be aligned internally. But what we're realizing now is because we've achieved that, now we also have to go and align externally as well. So how do we change that conversation, that dynamic? We created a platform called Eclipse. It's our supplier collaboration platform. Where we're convening some of the world's largest packaging and raw material suppliers, amongst others, to come together and to think through what will it take to get to that net zero or that lower carbon future? What are the hotspots or what are the key opportunities for us to tackle? How can we co-pilot? How can we co-innovate? This is a new way of thinking. It requires a mindset shift because we're all in this together, right? As we're building that future and the pathways towards that future. That's on one hand with the large suppliers, but we also in the process realize that we only still would have 85-90% of the solutions that we're looking for. So we have to go and identify new innovative partners as well. So we launched our 100+ Accelerator program where we've accelerated, with the current cohort, we'll have accelerated over 100 startups that are actually working to close the gaps against our public commitments on agriculture, water, packaging, climate, inclusive growth, upcycling. So there's a lot within that space. But the way we do that, again, is not just the core sustainability team that goes and selects these startups. It's actually dozens of folks within the business, down to an energy and fluids director, an agronomist, a packaging specialist that will look into these startups, these solutions that are out there, the breakthrough thinking that's out there, and try to bring them in, pilot, and then look for ways to scale. So for me, the opportunity is, I think the world needs reasons to believe, and there are reasons to believe out there. So what are those startups, those breakthrough solutions? What are the powerful collaborations that are happening that can really accelerate a change?
Yeah, I have to say, as a reporter who's been covering this for more years than I like to count, you often see goals be announced and come and go. I think there can be a fair amount of cynicism, which is not always productive, about the long-term integrity of those goals. So maybe we can talk about how to maintain momentum and long-term integrity, especially because corporations these days seem to reorganize themselves every 4.5 minutes. So it's very hard to keep a long-term path when it comes to this. Did you have any thoughts, Pooja?
Sure, I can kick it off. We think that tracking that data is just incredibly important. Auditing the data is incredibly important. But what we've also realized is there's a lack of consistency on how the data is calculated and reported. And also, we've noticed there's a lack of consistency in terms of the metrics that people look at. So unfortunately, this is not like GAAP accounting standards. There is no standardization. And that is why we took a leadership position at Carlyle and we led the ESG Data Convergence Project, where we partnered up with other GPs as well as LPs, and we agreed to a set of metrics. So obviously, we're in the early stages now of rolling out that program, but now the data is being aggregated, and we are tracking that data, and it is consistent across not only our portfolio companies, but also the portfolio companies of these other GPs and LPs who've signed up to that project. It is an extra layer of reporting for our portfolio companies. That is a consideration. Oftentimes, whether we're making control equity investments or structured equity investments, we have to wire that into our documents as well, so that management teams realize that that is data not only that has to be gathered, audited, and reported, but it's also performance data that they are held accountable to. So that is the second thing that we do here to make sure that we can maintain integrity in terms of what our reporting obligations are, and also that we are actually delivering what we intended to do when we made these investments as well. So that's just a very important part of that. The second thing I would say is that innovation is just a very important part to implementing sustainability across the supply chain. And we do believe that maintaining somewhat of a center of excellence where all of our portfolio companies can come to us and tap into our knowledge base can be some useful operating leverage that they can have access to.
That makes sense.
So you need to stay ahead of the curve even from an innovation perspective.
Absolutely. Now, we only have about 5 more minutes left. Abby, you had some questions you wanted from our audience?
Yes. We do have some submissions from the audience. The first one is related to the S in ESG of all of this, as in supplier diversity. What do you see as the major challenges of access and opportunity for minority and women-owned product/service providers?
Jennifer, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So I think, although I think Pooja may have a different thought, and actually you actually mentioned it as well, I think that where we see this is that there's only a certain amount of companies, there's a couple different answers depending on what sector you're trying to get a job in or provide a service or product to. There's only a certain amount of companies that do a certain amount of things. And so often you see certifications or trainings or things that can be inhibitors. The great part about it though, and I think if you go back to what Pooja just went through, is that the opposite of having clear goals and metrics on your ESG sustainability practices is actually large companies. And I talk about this a lot. Like, this is the world where small businesses win, because the opposite of being able to have the transparency of that supply chain is mergers and acquisition. And that's how the big guys get big. And so I think if I'm a small or medium-sized business, I'm going in and saying, you can trust me because I map and monitor, I have a sustainable practice, these are the things that I adhere to, I understand what you're asking me for, what you value, what you'll invest in, I can do X, Y, Z, and it becomes a very clean and easy conversation, and that provides alternative sourcing. So there's a lot, again, depending on the industry, there's lots of things that can keep you from it, but I do think from an ESG sustainability, this is an area where the small, medium-sized businesses can win because they have the transparency to be able to prove it easier.
Okay, and we have another one related to blockchain technology and asking if this is an answer to many supply chain issues we face in terms of promoting ethical and sustainable sourcing.
Does anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, I can give an example. It's one solution within a toolkit, right? So we're actually implementing it across our supply chains in agricultural sourcing regions where we want to get closer to that farmer. We know that farmer, we work closely with them, but we also want to bring visibility to them in terms of how much we're buying from them, how much we're paying for what we're buying, et cetera. So it's not just a benefit for us, it's also a benefit for that ultimate small supplier. So that's really important. But what we're also trying to tackle for is, in many cases, these small suppliers don't seem to exist in our supply chain. So they're not very bankable, right? So how do they then create that record that they actually sell to us ultimately? To an AB InBev local company. So by tackling the transparency within our supply chain for reporting purposes or for innovation or supply security purposes, we're also tackling the challenges of that farmer so that they can go and they can get the loans, the crop insurance, et cetera, that they need. So yes, very useful tool and it has a lot of potential for sure. I don't know if you guys.
Yeah, I was going to say, can I just add one thing? I think that what you just went through is exactly right. It's one of the tools, and I think agriculture is the one that we go fastest to from a blockchain. It's a very point situation. And when you think about scope 1, 2, and 3 from a sustainability, I talk about a T all the time because it's the linear, it's the blockchain that can be solved, right? Because I know exactly that farmer where I'm sourcing from, but then it's everybody else in that ecosystem that I need to be thinking about. And that's really the defense in depth we need to be thinking as we're mapping out our ecosystems, because nobody can be sustainable by themselves. So I think blockchain does what you just said perfectly. But if you're really thinking about ESG and sustainability, it's a much broader, and it's a very dynamic conversation. Things change.
Well, we now have only 1 minute left, so I think at this point, I really want to thank everyone for their contributions. I feel like I learned a lot, but there's clearly so much more to learn, but I'm so glad to know you are all out there and working on it, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone so much. That is the end of our Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit, New York. I would like to thank all of our speakers and our moderators for their time. And I'd really like to thank our summit advisors, BMO, IBM, NEOM, Red Sea Global, Salesforce, and Wells Fargo, and our supporting sponsor, Apex. And most of all, thank you to all of you for being such an engaged audience over this day. It's been amazing. We hope you can join us out in the reception area for a cocktail or networking reception. And if you'd like to catch any of these sessions, again, you can find them on BloombergLive.com to view them on demand. Thank you so much.